So this talk is about Webpack HMR. And Webpack HMR is a direct attack on the greatest benefit of being a software developer, is that you can kick off a build and then go do whatever you want and no one can challenge you. So HMR makes that impossible, unfortunately. So you might want to reluctantly evaluate it and then discard it as not an option. Now, we use Webpack and a lot of related technologies at Wingspan. Wingspan makes document management applications for regulated industries. I'm Martin Snyder. I'm the CTO of Wingspan, and this is a small part of what we do. Now, the question on everyone's minds, of course, is what is Webpack HMR? And it depends on the audience for how much of this we have to explain. So, how many people here, by a show of hands, have used Webpack before? And how many people have used HMR before? Ooh, well, you guys came to the right talk then. How about people that have worked with JavaScript modules before? And this is all important, right? Because what Webpack is, for people that aren't aware, is Webpack's a module bundler. And what that means is it takes a bunch of JavaScript modules and it will package them into a bundle for use in the web. And the predecessor to Webpack, not directly, but kind of logistically, is something called Browserify. And that existed. The only purpose of Browserify was to take node assets and package them for use in the browser-based JavaScript worlds. So then it's important to know what a module is. I mean, you can't really understand what a module bundler is if you don't know what a module is. And a module is a discrete section of JavaScript. So JavaScript started in the browsers, and everything was in the global namespace. And you could organize your work into files, and then they would load in a specific order. But it was kind of challenging to keep things separate. And there was different approaches to separating things over the 20 some odd years that we as an industry have been doing this. And then there was two competing standards for modules. There was CommonJS and there was AMD. And now with EX6, there's the one master module implementation that everyone will be using. But really what it is it's a way to self-contain JavaScript elements. And the key thing is that you can protect parts of the module from outside access. So you have some notion of private elements, which was previously only available in JavaScript through Chechery. So HMR, now we get to the good stuff, is hot module replacement. So you have all these modules, they're running in the browser, and Webpack HMR will let you replace a module while the application is running. Okay, so we're going to take a look at that. Now, one thing just to bear in mind is that there are limitations. This is not a panacea, but the key thing to understand is that we're only talking about hot replacement of your JavaScript and other assets of your application. We're not talking about the Webpack configuration files itself. We're not talking about other elements like things like your package.json. Those are not covered by this. So depending on where you are in the evolution of your project, this may or may not actually cover the things that you're working with. So let's try to make this real for everyone. We're going to switch the display configuration, which is a very risky operation. John, can you see the new screen here?
Yeah.
All right. So here we have this application that's running, and you can see it's listing the uptime there. And let's just pretend that we have some bug that only really happens when you get to 4-digit uptimes. Okay. So I've now reproduced this bug, and I want to work with it. I can come over here, and let's say we've established that what the bug is that whatever I want to change this text, and for some reason it's not working right. When you get a lot of things, so I can make the change here. I save it, and if you look over here in the browser, you can see that the change is reflected, and the uptime count has carried on. Okay. Now, if I were to refresh this page, it's going to start over. So it did not refresh the page. It was able to inject that JavaScript into the running application, and good things happen. And there's a lot of different ways this can manifest itself. So just as by way of a couple additional examples, I'm going to switch this one routine to no longer round. And we can see, oh, well, that looks ugly. And this makes it a little more valuable, right? So now you can see, okay, well, now I have a data formatting problem. I might have to get into some situation, and now I want to change the code for how that data is formatted, and I want to see that in the scenario that I've constructed. So that's a little more valuable. Webpack can package other assets, not just the JavaScript assets, but also things like styles and images and things like that. And in this particular case, what I want to show you is that I'm using a SAS file, right? And so I'm going to edit a Sass file and change this color, and Webpack will
CSS.
Yeah, Webpack will transpile it into CSS and deliver that through the same mechanism, and then you can see the style change. So, there's a very broad application, and there's other technologies that have done this long before Webpack. This is a little more general purpose. This is most often seen in combination with React and Webpack. But what I'm demonstrating to you today is just the raw Webpack elements. So we're not this is all just the basic stuff. You can use this for very broad purposes. Now, just again, another example of something that doesn't work. If I were to change, let's say I wanted to change this label, right, in some way, that change will not be brought in. And that's because in this case, Webpack's not managing this HTML file. So this HTML file that I've loaded, we can see here, it includes the script. This is the Webpack bundle that it's including, and that's the boundary. If something's in the bundle, then HMR will cover it, and if it's not in the bundle, then it won't. So the file we're looking at right here is the best illustration of what's covered and not covered. All right, so let's talk in a little more detail, and then we'll come back to what we're looking at. So there's the mechanical elements for Webpack itself, right? So Webpack has this capability, but it's not always used. And so we're just going to talk about what does and does matter for that. This part ends up being really simple. Webpack initially it was fairly complicated to configure Webpack for this, and they've made some changes that have made it very simple. So this is the minimal Webpack package JSON I could come up with. Again, these are dev dependencies. This just doesn't get bundled with your runtime elements normally. You just need Webpack and the Webpack dev server. You don't really need anything else. Now, this stuff also works with the Webpack dashboard for people that are using that, and I can demonstrate that a little later for people that want to see it. But there's really you don't need any extra dependencies on your project to use this. This is part of the Webpack dev server. Now, typically, what you would see is in your dev dependencies, Webpack and a whole bunch of other tooling, and this is very common. None of this has anything to do with hot module replacement. Okay, there are some cases like if you want to use React with HMR, there's some additional dependencies you need, but just for the out of the box HMR, there's nothing special. So you would load this up as normal, and then you get to the Webpack config. The minimal Webpack config that this demo all works with is actually smaller than this, but it's so small as to defy belief. So I left a little extra in there. You don't need to do much unless you kind of grow into more complicated scenarios. And I'll talk about some of them at the very end, where there are sometimes some things you need to do in your Webpack config to address HMR. But in this minimal example that I put together, which is fully functional, it's not required. So we require Webpack as normal. We put our entry point, and in this case, I use the loader to transpile ES6 down to ES5, and all the JavaScript examples in this are all ES6 examples. So it works with the dev server. It works with dashboard, and what it looks like in your package JSON is you just have to launch either one with the -- hot and -- inline arguments. And that will instruct Webpack to actually alter the web config to put the right plugins and modules in there to support all this. Now, the JavaScript side is a little more complicated. On the JavaScript side, you have to actually turn on HMR. So if you don't do anything with your JavaScript files, you won't enjoy any of these benefits or capabilities. And then it turns out that just turning it on is not enough. If you haven't prepared your code base to deal with this, then you'll have some problems. HMR won't work correctly, and there are facilities to address that and compensate. So, I mean, the big thing is your file has a side effect. Like, for instance, in the example that we were looking, which we'll get back to, we have a set interval call, right? It's going to install a callback handler, which is going to execute every 1 second to update the display. That's a side effect of loading the file, and you have to accommodate that. Or like if you keep reloading it, you'll keep getting more and more handlers, and strange things will happen. You might have state in your JavaScript file that needs to survive the reload. And again, in our example, the big example of that is the uptime. Like when was the page loaded? When was the module loaded? This is JavaScript state that we're going to store. And if we start replacing the modules, then we could potentially lose that. So we have to do that. And then there are circumstances where you just don't want HMR to try to do what it does because you know bad things are going to happen. You need a way to instruct it to do that. So the first one's really easy. There is a module object that's available. This is true for all the module formats. And then when HMR is enabled at the server layer, then there's this hot object, which has a couple other interfaces. It's trivially the documentation on this API is pretty good. So I don't really include any of that here for everyone. So you can detect if you're hot or not, which there used to be a website for that. That's no longer necessary. And the other nice thing about this is that the code that you write to address HMR will not run in production, right? This is something that, especially when you're doing something like a Babel compiler or a Webpack or something to construct it, it knows at construction time that module.hot is false, and it can actually eliminate all the code, right? So it isn't just a question of my code will be there and it won't execute. It can actually eliminate all this stuff. And so these are only things for development scenarios. You can use HMR in production. They say it's not production ready, but it will probably work. It's probably just not worth it. I mean, every single connection, every single page load will create like a WebSocket back to the server and stuff. It's probably not the kind of thing you would want to do anyway. So if you think of it in that terms, like this is a development element, and it will be optimized out when you build it. So this is really simple, and you only put this in once. So you have all these JavaScript files, all these assets, as part of your project, and you put this in at the entry point. So if we think back to that Webpack config.js that I showed, it declared an entry point of index.js. That index.js is the one that needs this, and it turns out that the syntax is important. It looks innocent enough, but this is actually saying I'm the end of the line for HMR. If you put this somewhere else, you'll get some very strange behaviors because things on the other side of that boundary won't behave correctly. This is actually declaring that I don't export anything that anyone else consumes. It's not really important to know so long as you only put it at the entry point. But if you do start playing around with this exact code construct, you're basically creating a severable link in the HMR context that you don't want to have. So now we get to side effects, and what you really need for side effects, you need a way to undo your side effects if possible, right? So if you can't undo your side effects, then we're in kind of that bailout scenario that I listed on that slide. We'll get to that in a second. But let's say you can. So again, this example where we had a set interval handle. For people that have used that before, you can actually, when you do that, you can get a kind of a handle to the callback, and then you can deregister it, right? So you can basically put a disposed callback on your module, which will let you unload, like a destructor, like a finalized routine at the class level for other languages. But this is kind of a module level. The module is unloading. It's distinct to hot replacement. So there is an opportunity to turn stuff off. So it also then turns out that same dispose interface, if we look back here, dispose here is taking no arguments. It just gives you a chance to undo things. But something is passed to dispose. It will pass you basically an empty JSON object. And you can store state in that. And the module engine, the module manager, whatever that happens to be, this isn't just potentially Webpack, it will take whatever you put on data and it will feed it back to the module the next time it loads. And so it does that with the module.hot.data element. So this code is written defensively. If we look right in the middle of this, const data equals module hot data or the empty object. The first time you load, data is null or undefined or something. But then if you once you reload, it will be created. And you can see here that we are able to, at the bottom there, we're able to set a state value on data. And then if we look just above it, when we then load, we can examine that state value and we can reinitialize. So now with ES6, we have access to the const keyword. This is an example of where you would not want to use const because we're going to load that state when the module initializes, but then if we're hot, we're going to potentially replace that state with what we set aside during the replacement process. Okay, and again, all of this code will drop out in production, everything in the if module hot. So we'll be left with something, if you looked at it in production, it's like, oh, well, geez, why is this thing a let instead of a const? And the answer is to potentially allow you to do HMR. And so then we can bail out. And there's a couple different ways you can do this. Just for clarity, I'm using the decline method. In this case, what I think is most common, if you're writing a lot of JavaScript code yourself and you're interested in using HMR, then you're never going to need to bail out. You're just going to be able to do the two things I was talking about. You'll be able to accommodate your side effects, or you'll be able to transfer your state, or you'll be able to not end up in the painted into the corner in the first place. But if that's not the case, let's say the problem is in a module which you're including. Then it's like, well, okay, I'm not going to make that module support HMR. I mean, the library maintainers probably would reject the change. It might be a really hard problem to solve also, because this is a concept which they weren't thinking of. So what I can say is I can tell the HMR engine, hey, if you detect an update here, decline it. And ultimately what that will force is that will force the entire page to refresh. The system will detect something has changed. I do have a hot change, but I'm not really able to accommodate it safely, and therefore I'll decline the hot change, and this will cascade through. And there's ways to kind of catch that and prevent it from forcing the reload of the page, but it's usually you're better off. And again, you have to ask yourself, especially if it's like a third-party dependency, how often is this changing that you would care about a hot scenario? So this is definitely something that I found is more useful when you're giving a talk about HMR than when you're trying to practically use HMR. I found this is just not worth going through and actually declining stuff. And you can see the syntax is in here also, where if you are going to, if you're not safe yourself, you can just call decline with no arguments, and then that will kind of blow up everything and bail out. And again, that's similar to the accept with no arguments, where there's implications of that which are hidden by the simplicity of the call. So hopefully, it's not something that people are doing a lot of. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to switch back, and we are going to we're going to kill this guy over here. So this is Webpack dev server running on the side. I'm going to switch from the demo project to the demo with no HMR. And then we're going to run again. Now I'm going to switch to the Webpack dashboard here, just so people that aren't familiar can see it. It's basically running exactly the Webpack dev server, but it just formats the output differently. So it's kind of a handy add-on. It's pretty simple to install and get working. I found in my work, I never had any impact to other parts of my project from adding dev server. I just added the dev dependency and then add the scripts to the package JSON to run it. And we went and, it just kind of worked the way that you would hope it would work. Well, I'll just leave that up, I guess. All right, and so now we're running off this other project. We're going to reload this page. It's exactly the same code, except in this case, I've stripped out all the HMR stuff, and we're going to try to fix it. So we're going to close this. We're going to undo our changes. Fortunately, this project's available on GitHub. I'll share the link at the end. If we get into trouble, we can just copy and paste the working example out of there. So if it's something where you want to work through it yourself, you have the starting point and the ending point. So we're just going to repeat. I can't move this thing at all. We're just going to repeat some of the changes we were making. So here we'll change that, and we'll save it. And trust me, I'm hitting Command S, and you can see we're not getting the change. Right, and nothing's going on here. So, so we're not doing HMR. We'll do that. So if module.hot accept. Like I said, the deceptively simple command, and we can see that over here that we got a little flash on the dashboard. We did rebuild it, but of course the client doesn't know anything because what was delivered to the client doesn't have any of the good stuff going on. So now we'll refresh the page, and now we're going to get into it, we hope. What I want to do is so this server isn't doing HMR. So we're going to make the server do HMR. Hot and dash inline. And then because that's not a hot change, now I got to restart. Except I put them on dashboard and not the.
So you'll know because you'll see some connection.
Yeah. So now we can see. So we get some console output that HMR is enabled, and we get some stuff. We get the WebSocket open. We get the control channel and stuff like that. So let's let me just kill this for a second. We'll start over. So now we come in and we make these changes, and what we see here is the page refreshed. Okay. So let me just try to adjust this a little bit so we can see it all at the same time. So we make the change and the page refreshed. And if this is happening to you, that's going to be very frustrating. And that's exactly what this preserve log is for. So if you're in a situation with pretty much any aspect, like the network traffic, any aspect of the Chrome debugger or any browser debugger, you look for preserve log or a simple feature or a similar feature. And what that will do is that will not refresh the debugger when it refreshed the page. Okay, and that's exactly where you would want to do. So you can see, oh, this thing's coming in, and it couldn't apply the update, and it's because it wasn't accepted, and so on and so forth. And this 77 ends up being the number of the module. So when you're using Webpack, like all your import and require statements are replaced with a Webpack require for other reasons as well. But they end up being like indexed into a giant array. And so when you're doing HMR, what's happening is the new JavaScript code is coming down and getting thrown into that same index, and then it looks at the dependency tree, which is constructed because it controls all the require statements, and then it knows how to cascade that through the whole thing. So this guy isn't accepted, and that's where we'll add this code, and then we'll be off to the races. So let me just refresh this. We're gonna turn off preserve log, and so we'll know every time we see this for the rest of the demo, we'll know that something was rejected for some purpose. So now let's make some changes. So we can see here this is left at 33. And we're going to just change that back to seconds. Okay? And now we'll see what happens. Oh, well, look, that's exactly what we were talking about, was having a side effect in the module, right? So what happens, we look over at our code, is we called set interval when we loaded our module, and then we made a change, okay? And the old interval, basically that even though we've gotten rid of all that JavaScript and the module's gone and replaced with a new thing, that callback handler is still installed on the window, and it won't get garbage collected. That code is still running. Okay, so fortunately we had the foresight to keep that interval ID from the set interval call. And then so what we'll say is module.hot.dispose, and we'll just add a little callback here, and we'll say window clear interval, and we'll pass that in. Now, this is not going to fix our problem. This hot change will come in. Okay, and we saw that it was accepted. We see the app is up to date, but it's still flickering. The reason it's still flickering is because we already hosed ourselves. We're not going to. What we just cleaned up. We cleaned up the second one and replaced it, but the first one, which we orphaned in the first place, is still orphaned. Okay, so to enjoy that particular fix, we're going to have to refresh the page and start over. Once you've made a mistake like that, even though you can explore fixes with HMR, you can't completely clear it out. And so now we see that if we abbreviate seconds with secs, it'll drop down right there, and all the right things are happening. Okay, so that's how you deal with side effects in HMR. So now we're going to come and we're going to take a look at our rounding example. So let's do what we were doing before. We're going to change this to not round anymore. Okay, look on the left, we're at 30 seconds, and we save it, and we're back to 1 second, right? But I can assure you the page didn't load. You can look at the console log. We didn't reload the page, right? And so now we're seeing, oh, well, we lost that data. We used to have that data, and now we've lost it. And so right here is where it's stored. So we have this method getCurrentSeconds, which is the one that we're talking about, and we store the module start time right in our module. We do this privately. No one else can touch this thing. It's private data to the module, right? But it is state, right? This is exactly what state is. This module has its own state, and what we need is we need a way to transfer that state. So now we're just going to apply what we talked about. So if module.hot, now we're going to say, okay, well, so when we dispose, module.dispose, now we're going to take advantage of this data argument coming in, and we're going to store data.state, and we're just going to say, well, it's equal to this module start time. And if we had more, we can make state, an object, and we can say, something like that. Like that might be a little safer to do. You can see that, if you just looked at what happened, Webpack was all kinds of upset there. I think it was because I saved a file that didn't compile. Let me bring this guy up. So it's mad. Because it's module hot dispose. Right, so it's a compile error in the file. It's kind of blowing the whole world up. If I hadn't refreshed the page, it actually would have recovered cleanly once I fixed that error. So now we're saving the state, and now we go and we make the we'll switch this back to get our nice rounding, right? And oh no, it's still gone, right? Because saving the state isn't enough. We have to reinitialize the module. Every time the module loads, it's going to execute this line, right? That's not good enough. So we don't need extra conditionals, because if we're hot, then we know the state might have been saved, okay? And like I said, the first time in, so there's a module.hot.data. That's where the good stuff's going to be. First time through is going to be null, okay? So you always have to defensively access this thing. So we'll say, const data is that or some empty object. Now we're safe. And then we'll say that the module start time equals data dot state dot module start time, and that would always be there, except in the case where we've initialized to the empty object, so state won't be available. So again, we'll just cheat, right? We'll simplify this just to not have to do a lot of conditionals. So we'll say that's there. And the first time through, it'll be undefined, but because it'll be an integer, we'll probably be okay. But we're not gonna worry about that. We'll say that it's 0 the first time. Or no, sorry, that won't work. What we want to say is only set it if it's there. So we're only going to replace our value if that happens to be defined. All right, so now we're going to refresh. Give it a couple seconds here, and then we'll flip it, and we should have 8 and change. All right, so we're good. So let's, okay, I think it'll probably drive people crazy if we leave it with the non-rounded version. So we'll fix that for people. And let's take a look at bailing out. So we have a DOM helper here. And if we look back at our index, that's all the set interval is doing. It's just using our little DOM library to write text to an element. And why would you write your own DOM library? Why not just use jQuery? But I'm all about abstraction. So I've written a wrapper around jQuery in this case. And you can see it's, one of the many different ways that we can write to an element. There's nothing special going on. But what if, for instance, I was working on a fix for jQuery? I thought that my code had exposed a jQuery bug, and I decided to dive into node modules and start editing jQuery, right? I mean, this is something, again, by way of example only, right? So in this case, what we've decided is that what we want to do is, the important thing is to remove the copyright header. Yeah, idea is like, what are you doing? Oh, trust me, I know. So I just changed jQuery, and that's going to then cascade the DOM, and who knows, right? I mean, this is very treacherous waters. It's unlikely, given the age of jQuery, that they anticipated this scenario. But you can also imagine it not just with this. Like if I while this is running, did an npm update or install, or you can imagine cases where you might pull in a new dependency. So it's not completely impossible this would happen. But you can see that as I'm changing jQuery, adjusting the comment, the HMR engine is realizing that, oh, well, look, 79 changed, which, let's pretend it's jQuery, and that made dom.js change, that's probably 78, and that made index.js change, and that's 77. So you can see how it's cascading through and replacing all this stuff. And what we want to say is in our, because the DOM's the one that owns the dependency, we want to be like, well, look, hang on a second. I know that we don't want this, right? So I'm going to say module.decline, and I'm just going to pass in exactly what I imported. All right? Oh, yeah, thanks. I thought you said aha. And so now, if I come and I hit jQuery again, we're running out of comments to delete. Now you see what's happening there. So it detected that there was a hot change, and it came back down just like you would expect. But then it went and it refreshed the page. And so we can you can take a quick look here. We can preserve the log, and we can see that, okay, so it's aborted because it was specifically declined. All right. So that's how we take care of that. Now, decline is, again, if you look at the docs, it's significantly complicated. I mean, you can do things like pass an array of dependencies that you want to decline. You can also implement like a decline handler, which can then do specific stuff. I don't think it's a world worth getting into. I mean, if you have to do really complicated things there conditionally, it's probably better to just always decline it and not do it. And that's pretty much it. So now just let's take a quick look at a couple other things. There's this pulse routine that I'm calling an index, and that's just returning the string, so we can change this, right? And we'll see that that's going to come through hot and it preserves the time. All the good things are happening. Because this is a pure module, and by that I mean it has, it exports things that don't have any dependencies. There's no side effects. There's no state of the module. Like everything is, purely functional. It doesn't need to do anything to play in this game. All right. So this works as an HMR module without me having to put any of this other conditional stuff in there, and it works because index.js was the entry point. Right? If index.js didn't need this dispose handler, it would still have to accept because it's the entry point. Because of that, then other things downstream from it don't need to. Okay? And what this leads you to is that HMR is the easiest to apply and use when you're doing purely functional things. And if you're not, then HMR is unwieldy to use. And the recommendation that I would give most people is that even if you're not interested in HMR as a technology or as an enabler of any particular workflow, it's worth making your code work with it because you will learn more about your code and you will improve the overall code quality by creating more modules which meet the criteria to be hot without any special behavior. And then the other thing, just to take a quick look at, we'll look at the styles. There's nothing in the style sheet about HMR. It turns out that what has the HMR enabling is the style loader in Webpack. So they did that for you. So you don't have to worry about that. There's no complexity associated with really any of the different ways you can implement styles. That's just going to work. So that's just it's worth pointing out that there is magic involved, but it's not the kind of magic that you really get exposed to or have to worry about. Okay, so there are some additional things to talk about, which we're not going to include today due to the complexity involved. So one thing that I found in my research and working with this and other elements of Node is that a lot of times when you get to a larger code base, you're going to want to be working with multiple Node modules at the same time. And generally speaking, if you're working with multiple Node modules at the same time that you control, then you're going to want to symlink them together one way or another. Right? On the file system, you're going to want them to kind of have ready access to each other and not be at arm's length the way you would normally get with an npm install. If you do that, there is some complexity to the Webpack configuration. It's a little too specialized and a little too lengthy to include in this talk, but it's worth noting. If you have questions, reach out to me on the normal channels, Twitter and email and whatnot, and I can give you some links. I have other very useful Stack Overflow posts and a couple blog posts. It's a little tricky to figure out, but ultimately what can happen is that Webpack itself, before you even get to HMR, Webpack can end up down in a nested Node modules folder and lose track of itself. And it starts looking for Webpack configuration elements in a non-Webpack module. And like Webpack itself will cease working. It's not about HMR, it's about Webpack and Node. And there's very good reasons for this, which are historical in nature and fascinating, but only fascinating to a few people. So just know that if you do a lot of work with symlinked modules, you're going to want to focus very carefully on that first, especially if you're trying to work with Webpack in like a research project as a separate effort to investigate the technology for inclusion into your work. If your work includes symlinked modules, you absolutely want your research effort to include symlinked modules because you're going to want to learn those lessons in a narrow context. Another thing that comes up a lot, and this is again more of a Webpack issue than an HMR issue, especially today since HMR is pretty clean, is just be aware that this world does not particularly handle developer versus production builds well. So you're going to be dealing with things like source maps. Again, especially when you're doing like HMR and your hot replacement, your source maps become important. You're going to have a lot of potential confusion, and you're going to want to turn a lot of these things off when you're in production. There is a best practice for this, which is generally speaking to have two configurations, a developer configuration and a production one. And the production one should require the developer one and then change it in place. Again, if you don't know what I'm talking about, you don't care, just skip over it. But if you do wade too far into this world, it's a question you're going to come up with at some time. Again, it's not exactly on my topic, and we don't have time to fully investigate it. But that is something that that you're just going to want to know about. And then the other thing is, I mentioned in the very beginning that HMR is frequently used with React.js. There are HMR extensions for React, which you will need to include. And there is a ton of magic involved in that, because what happens is, like, you get all these React controls in your project, and they might be using React State, and React State needs special handling. There's other things that need special handling as well. It's complicated. Don't worry about it. It works great because, I mean, the React guys are the driving force behind all this stuff. So I can assure you it works better with React than it does with any other library out there. But just know there's extra steps that I didn't talk about. And when you look at tutorials on this, they almost all involve React anyway. So that's not something I think that people need any particular guidance from me to explore. So that's everything I prepared for you. I'd like to thank JB and the rest of the LibertyJS organizers. Certainly everyone that attended both the conference and my talk individually, and all the sponsors as well. Looking forward to a great day, and if I can field any questions if people have them.